In January of 1945, the world's most powerful heads of state, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta, a Crimean resort city. Their agenda was to facilitate an end to World War II. The war had raged for more than 5 years at this point, and much of Europe was in ruin. Since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets had closed in on Germany, freeing Eastern Europe from the Nazis, but liberation was not their only goal, and Stalin had no intention of leaving his newfound territory. Critics of FDR often cite his negotiations at Yalta as a sellout to Stalin, but this is an oversimplification. All concessions to the USSR at the Yalta Conference were legitimate and necessary to rapidly end the war. FDR used charm and diplomacy to negotiate with Stalin, achieving the best possible terms from an imperfect situation. Yalta was first and foremost a wartime conference. Fighting on two fronts made Germany's collapse inevitable, but the war was by no means over. In fact, Germany continued to make technological advancements. Aircraft, tank, and U-boat production had increased, and sinkings of Allied ships increased as a result. The success of Nazi propaganda enforced sturdy morale up until the end. Most Germans believed that if they held out for long enough, the Allies would fracture, and that if Germany was defeated, it would be destroyed entirely. The combination of these two beliefs made the Germans fight tenaciously. In an assessment of Germany's situation, the Combined Intelligence Committee stated that, although their resources are inadequate for a prolonged defense of the Reich, the Germans can postpone the decision by fanatical refusals to accept defeat and by skillful employment of such resources as they have. Any estimate of the probable time of German collapse is highly speculative and probably misleading. It was with this overtone that the Allies conducted the conference. The Soviet Union played a vital role in bringing Germany to its knees. Stalin said that there had been no demand from the British and Americans for the Russian winter offensive, and no pressure was exerted by them to bring it about. The Russians had commenced in the first place to engulf as much territory as possible. That being said, they could stop at any time and sit on the parts of Eastern Europe captured thus far. The Allies had to ensure this didn't happen. They were absolutely reliant on the Russians to finish off Germany. Knowing that finishing the war as quickly and with as little loss of American life as possible was FDR's primary objective, Stalin had leverage at the conference. All the concessions made by FDR were justifiable in the name of saving American lives. The fact alone that Russia continued to carry most of the burden of the war against Germany made the Yalta Conference a victory for FDR and for America. The diplomats at Yalta faced overwhelming obstacles. Not only did the leaders have different objectives, but the cultural divide between the Bolsheviks and the West was immense. Negotiations were partly an exercise in overcoming the feelings of prejudice that underpinned the conference. Stalin's officials were not well educated and were looked down upon by their counterparts. Stalin himself was the son of a poor cobbler, whereas FDR and Churchill received high-level educations. In general, the Westerners saw the Russians as being savages, not quite European, and the Soviets saw the Westerners as bourgeois thieves looking for the first available opportunity to undermine the poor hard-working communists. Stalin was born a peasant. His rise to power resulted from his craftiness, his ruthless determination, and his aggressive ambition. These qualities made him difficult to negotiate with. He was extremely stubborn on certain topics of discussion, like the issue of Polish independence. Stalin's vision was of a Soviet-controlled, communist Eastern Europe, and he would stop at nothing to achieve it. Churchill was the best educated at Yalta. He came from an aristocratic family and epitomized the bourgeoisie. Churchill hated communism and wished to stop the advance of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Churchill and Stalin were cordial at the Yalta Conference, but the fact remains they were polar opposites. Churchill even had drafted a plan for Operation Unthinkable, which was a surprise attack on the Soviets to ensure, quote, a square deal for Poland. But following through with this plan would have been unthinkable, and it was soon scrapped. This sort of mentality is exactly why Churchill was not up to the task of negotiating with Stalin. His distrust was too severe and too apparent. He could not charm Stalin, and this made him the wrong man for the job. Few could have bridged the gap between the two as successfully as FDR did. Roosevelt believed in the power of friendship and personal diplomacy. He was an excellent negotiator, and he found himself negotiating with both Stalin and Churchill. The relationship between the president and the prime minister was much more tense than is often acknowledged. They disagreed on many topics, such as how to deal with communism. Churchill had been a staunch anti-communist since the 30s, while Roosevelt was less concerned with the threat that communism posed, making him more willing to compromise with the Bolsheviks. What bothered FDR more than communism was imperialism, something that the English were more guilty of than the Russians. He said in a correspondence with Churchill, "American public opinion cannot understand why, if the British government is willing to permit the component parts of India to secede from the British Empire after the war, it is not willing to permit them to enjoy what is tantamount to self-government during the war. Their relationship became so strained that eventually they ceased referring to each other as "My dear Franklin" or "My dear Winston," opting instead for the more formal titles of the President and the Prime Minister.
Churchill and Roosevelt did not agree on everything. There's this image, this popular image that's created of a kind of Anglo-American agreement and the Soviets are the bad guys. Roosevelt really saw himself as having to work with both Stalin and Churchill equally, and sometimes he agreed with Stalin more than he did with Churchill.
It's difficult to imagine FDR getting along with Stalin, who is often included with Hitler in the list of genocidal dictators. One of FDR's greatest strengths, however, was his ability to extend friendship to someone like Stalin when diplomacy required it. His behavior conveyed to Stalin that the conference would not be a matter of West versus East. In a meeting with Stalin, FDR even poked fun at Churchill, saying that the British were a peculiar type of people who wished to have their cake and eat it too. Stalin also liked FDR because of the Lend-Lease support provided during Germany's invasion of Russia. Stalin was gullible at first. He placed his faith in Hitler early in the war, and Hitler's subsequent betrayal made him wary of trusting FDR. Roosevelt's ability to gain Stalin's trust speaks to his skill as a diplomat. The agreements made at Yalta are sometimes blamed for escalating tensions that led to the Cold War, but the fact is they were fair and unavoidable. One of the most famous was the decision to divide Germany into zones of occupation. It was essential to all the leaders that German militarism not rise again in Europe. The Allies needed to enforce unconditional surrender, and this would have been nearly impossible to do without exerting regional control over Germany. The West Allies were wary of Stalin, and feared a Germany with too much Soviet influence. Britain and France also needed Germany to remain somewhat strong economically, because without Germany the European economy as a whole would suffer. On the other hand, Stalin needed to protect his own interests. Germany could not be allowed to become as powerful as it was. As such, the major Allied nations each needed a peace in Germany so they could, to some extent, oversee and control what went on post-war. One of Stalin's greatest fears was that Germany would rise again and become a threat. This was the root of Stalin's obsession with controlling Poland. He needed a buffer territory in between Germany and Russia. Seeing as Russia was invaded through Poland 3 times in recent memory, Stalin's fear was not unwarranted. The provisions made at Yalta concerning Poland agreed to reorganize the Soviet-installed communist government, and confirmed that the eastern border of Poland would be the Curzon line. The leaders determined that there would be free elections in Poland, but of these FDR wittily added that they should be as pure as Caesar's wife, who he never saw but assumed was very pure. To this, Stalin replied, "They said that about her, but in fact she had her sins." Naturally, the developments at Yalta were considered a betrayal of national self-determination and freedom in Eastern Europe. This view of things, however, is short-sighted, because it neglects the reality that Stalin had absolute power in that situation. Soviet troops occupied Poland, and given Stalin's stubbornness, nothing short of another war would free it. Needless to say, this was not an option for FDR. He was forced into recognizing Russian influence in Poland because there was no good alternative, and because he needed Russian support in Europe and Asia.
Roosevelt was agreeing to what was logical and unavoidable. That's not appeasement. He wasn't giving anything to Stalin. Stalin's armies were already in Poland.
The 3 other major decisions of Yalta were Soviet participation in the war against Japan, the terms of German reparations, and Soviet participation in the UN, the last of which was the most meaningful. FDR left the Yalta Conference hopeful that a new era of peace and continuing cooperation would prevail, and he saw the UN as its foundation. The Yalta Conference is a study in FDR's skillful diplomacy. Simultaneously negotiating with Stalin and Churchill, Roosevelt was able to make the most out of a situation in which all parties were at odds. His ability to use personal man-to-man diplomatic tactics was unrivaled. He was able to at least partially bridge the enormous divide between the 3 leaders using his charisma. Because of Roosevelt, the Allies did not fracture, and Germany was swiftly defeated. What would follow soon after was a power struggle between the US and the USSR, but this was not caused by Yalta, and it does not detract from the achievement that Yalta represents. At the conference, the 3 most powerful people in the world met, resolved their differences, both personal and ideological, and achieved a compromise. Their sacrifices helped create the longest-lasting peace in European history.
In which our children and grandchildren, yours and mine, the children and grandchildren of the whole world, must live and can live. And that, my friends, is the only message I can give you, but I feel it very deeply, as I know that all of you are feeling it today and are going to feel it in the future.